Greetings everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on Historiographical Approach to Indian Art. In this, we shall be discussing the subjective analysis associated with art. This means that art is not only something that can be admired for its beauty. So, various artistic accomplishments associated with India's past have a deeper meaning associated with them. So, this meaning can be understood with reference to specific political, social, economic and cultural context, and it is this that essentially constitutes historiography. Indian art can be traced back to prehistoric period, so beginning from Paleolithic age in India. The subcontinent has been home to several migratory populations, different religious creeds, and each one has contributed to the culturally rich artistic art forms that have evolved and have become part of the Indian civilization. So therefore, a very important aspect of Indian art has been its association with religion, which across time and space has kind of induced and encouraged different art forms. So, religious ideals have always been a stimulus to creativity, and Indian art is no exception to this rule. Another very important aspect associated with Indian art is the element of diversity, which arises from diverse cultural traditions. So, Indian subcontinent down the ages has produced some of the greatest Buddhist, Jain, Hindu and Islamic art forms that have materialized the various religious ideals. So, some very famous temples and other religious shrines of early India as well as medieval India embody the abstract philosophical and religious ideas of several diverse cultural traditions of the subcontinent. So, we cannot really limit our understanding about Indian art to any specific religion or creed. Another very important aspect associated with any kind of understanding related to Indian art is the emphasis on spirituality. Art historians are of the opinion that Indian artworks, in a sense, are not just aesthetic expressions of shape, form, or any kind of physical representation, but they are visualizations of the absolute reality, of the transcendent quality in the existence of the beings. So, different art activities traditionally were considered a spiritual act, and the Shilpa Shastras, the technical treatises, they emphasize greatly on this particular aspect of art. So, whenever we approach any kind of study of art, this realization must be there at the back of the mind. Then all arts, whether they were performing or plastic or graphic or architectural, were considered divine and also were perceived as interrelated. A very important discussion pertaining to features of Indian art can be conducted with reference to the writings of Partha Mitra. So, according to Partha Mitra, the Indian artist made no distinction between fine arts or decorative arts, as was the case in Western civilization. So, while in the Western world, both these kind of art forms, that is fine arts and decorative arts, could be considered as separate subjects or in separate kind of brackets, but the same could not be true as far as Indian art scene was concerned. This led to a great tradition of decorated utensils or things of daily use. So, for example, pottery, in which something as basic as grain had to be stored or water had to be carried, could also be ornamental, could be decorated, and it was decorated definitely. So, we have different kind of specialization as far as different kind of pottery forms were concerned, and these were ranging from different kind of color combinations, shapes, sizes, geometrical designs, as well as polished or unpolished. So, an intense decorative urge led to a profuse use of ornamentation on surfaces, and this kind of became a very essential feature of Indian art and architecture, where there were hardly any walls that were plain, and where there were hardly any pots that were not that did not carry a specific kind of design. Then another very interesting feature associated with Indian art is the aspect of a different meaning of realism altogether. So, realism did not really mean projecting something as it existed in reality. The goal of the Indian artist was to embody philosophical and humanistic ideals in his creation, as arts were considered a spiritual activity, as I have just mentioned. So, therefore, this whole emphasis on spirituality and meditative contemplation led Indian artists to create a kind of spectator and to project something to their spectator who would realize the transcendent state during the course of that creative activity. So, therefore, different meaning of realism emerged from time to time. Nature to Indian artist was transitory as well as elusive. It was not kind of depiction of complete reality as it existed, and it was also a reality that was embedded in the divine spirit, the universal truth, and this ultimate truth is realized and experienced through an artist's imagination. And this cannot only be considered for early Indian art forms. If we talk about today's context, if we talk about contemporary art scene, then also we can say that this otherworldly realism or abstract ideas find a very important place in projection of art. Then another very essential feature that one can highlight is that of collective consciousness. So, to portraiture in sculpture or painting was hardly the concern or the objective of artists in early Indian art scene. The paradigm shift came from the coming of to portraiture during Mughal period. So, the Mughal painting and the art forms that evolved under that umbrella definitely considered portraiture to be a very important aspect of painting. But this kind of portraiture painting was not very popular prior to that period, because the emphasis was more on collective consciousness, and this lack of anatomy sense did not happen because of dearth of skills or shortage of that kind of skilled worker. Rather, in the way the artist perceived the world in the process of creating higher and more subtle type of art forms, which probably conveyed a deeper meaning. Finally, this also resulted in Indian artists being largely unknown in ancient and medieval India, because the artist was part of the collective consciousness of people, and there was very less scope for this kind of individualism that could be recognized as far as projection of art was concerned. Now, so far we have focused on the importance of religion as far as Indian art forms were concerned, and how influential religion, whether it was Hinduism or Buddhism or Jainism, had been, and how different forms of art were being created as a result of inspiration coming from religion. But this cannot be considered as the only truth, because there was definitely existence of secular art also. Not all Indian art was spiritual. Secular art also was practiced, and that too under royal patronage and other agencies. So therefore, in this category we can consider palaces, forts, decorative utensils, pots, jewelry, civic architecture, the kind of which we had discussed when we were discussing Indus Valley civilization, then textiles, folk and tribal art forms, all these fall in this category of secular art. Besides, motifs and other symbols were also borrowed from one religious tradition to another, and from one medium to another. So therefore, there was considerable overlapping in various art forms, and this also is a feature which speaks volumes about our rich cultural heritage and the element of diversity. So therefore, there was no rigidity as to only a specific kind of motif or symbol could be shown in while erecting mosques or mausoleums. There was considerable give and take, and this kind of exchange of ideas has made Indian art all the more richer and unique. Another very important feature that art historians have pointed out is that there is no identity of a Hindu architecture or a Muslim architecture if we are talking in the context of Indian subcontinent, because interaction and adaptation was the key and is the key to understanding Indian art, both secular as well as religious. There are no great or low moments, in the sense we cannot discard a particular period of Indian history as not having experienced artistic efflorescence or great artistic accomplishments. Neither we should kind of describe any specific period of Indian history as a period of great accomplishment. So, for example, in traditional kind of historiography, Gupta age was projected as the classical golden age. However, this kind of categorization is questionable, because after all, any kind of artistic activity or any kind of cultural activity is an evolutionary process. It is not as if all the achievements were overnight made during the 100-200 years. They had a long history to it, and that aspect of evolution, that is continuity and change, must not be neglected. Nor was there any particular age in which there was complete decline of art. So therefore, we cannot describe medieval period as being devoid of artistic activities, because here we see a different kind of spread of artistic activities taking place. And it is also important to understand how it took several centuries for any kind of evolution of style to take place. Also, there were multiple discourses. In recent times, art historians have emphasized on the need to judge Indian art on its own term and not to apply the canons of Western universal art history to evaluate it. But before we describe this further, it is important to highlight that when this Western universal art, the idea of Western universal art came into being, especially in context of Indian history, we can say that it was during the colonial period when the British scholars, administrators, historians, archaeologists were trying to gather more and more information about India's past, because they, as colonial administrators, wanted to rule the country more sternly, and that could be done only if they knew about India in a better way. So therefore, they started kind of cataloging this. They started the process of creating and maintaining proper documentation, and it was then that they started comparing whatever was coming out from archaeology. They started comparing it to the way there were art objects in the West, and from there the bias also started. While reassessing Indian art away from colonial readings, one should not look for artistic teleology, in the sense Indian art does not move in a linear trajectory. So this kind of linear trajectory was something that British scholars were used to. So they kind of applied the same principles while trying to know more about early Indian art forms. And it is important that we question the linear development of art rather than kind of judging our own art forms with reference to the linear development. So rejecting the notion of linear development of art would further mean that we need to reject the primacy of any one historical formation, region, dynasty or patronage while evaluating Indian art. So Indian art is important and significant and relevant because of its own contemporary existence, its own context, and not due to its comparison with Greco-Roman art forms or for that matter classical age in Roman history. There are no focal imperial centers, local and distant traditions being just as vital in creating artistic forms. So this is how modern age historians have tried to analyze Indian art forms as they existed in the past, where the local is as important, where the regional is as important as the imperial center, because it was not as if the local or the regional was not creating any artistic form, or they were not kind of experimenting, and it was only the imperial center or the capitals that were important. This also means that instead of looking for influences, we need also to focus on the processes of creation. So therefore, the end product is not something which is the only important aspect while trying to analyze any piece of art, because the end product is the result of probably hundreds of years or thousands of years of experimentation, and artistic creations are multi-layered and are overlapping with multiple meanings. And herein comes the importance of postmodernism and post-structuralism in trying to understand the hidden meanings behind Indian art forms, whether it was sculpture or it was painting. So one cannot really avoid taking into account the socio-political context, and we have to move on to the history of study of Indian art with a wider perspective in mind. So for that, one has to appreciate that art is not only a study of an image or the physical existence of a statue, and neither it is about appreciation of the decorative elements that were there in Indian sculptures or temples or iconography, and it is not also only about the precise technical aspect. rather a far more important feature that a historian must study is the larger dimension of processes of state formation, politics, culture, economy, so on and so forth. So therefore, it is a more holistic process which encompasses the entire existence of humanity during a particular time period, which would not only focus on the technique of a particular kind of art form or the beauty of a particular kind of art form, rather the entire socio-political, economic, cultural, regional and religious aspect. So all art is conditioned in the social and political context. If this realization and this realization has definitely kind of brought about a more wider, a more deeper and a far more convincing meaning associated with different art forms. So therefore, one needs to analyze the paradigm shifts. So Indian art historiography has seen many paradigm shifts and changes since the first histories of art and architecture were written by the colonists during the middle and the later part of the 19th century. So while replicating or while describing different kind of art and architectural achievements of early India, the kind of description was definitely biased as it emerged from the pens of colonial administrators. The concerning issues were how to devise a chronological framework for the study of Indian art, and secondly, the issue of aesthetic evaluation of arts. So British scholars were more interested in knowing about the exact chronological framework as to which art piece could be dated to which period, and then kind of evolve a chronological framework. And secondly, they were very particular about the aesthetic evaluation of arts, and here the comparison was made with again the artistic accomplishments of Western civilization. As has been pointed out by Partha Mitter, writings spanning the period from 1874 to 1927 largely debated upon these issues and presented different theories. According to Partha Mitter, much of Indian art historiography, which we were familiar with till as late as 1970s, was influenced by the writings that had appeared between 1874 to 1927. So you can well imagine the kind of colonial imprint that these writings had on them. And because of this, the kind of understanding about Indian art form was left incomplete. Thank you.